Well, thank you all for being here. Today we're continuing our conversations, and our focus is on youth sport. And you may have noted we had a really good discussion with Professor David Bell from kinesiology. He's a really like a leading researcher on youth sports and on youth sports specialization. And one of the kind of challenges with youth sports, what he calls highly specialized athletes, is that this kind of increased occurrence of injury, especially at young ages. So just without going into great detail, because we do have that interview available with Professor Bell, he characterized highly specialized athletes as those who do a sport for 8 months or more a year, which is something I didn't know. I was thinking of specialized as someone who just does a sport, one sport. Now that's a single sport athlete. So you could be a single sport athlete and not be a highly specialized athlete. Say you just play football for 4 months of the year, and then you play an instrument, and you're in the theater and that, and you do a lot of things, but you just do one sport. You're technically not considered a highly specialized athlete. Some of this is semantics, but the key thing that Professor Bell shared was that when kids are highly specialized at young ages, especially kind of pre-adolescence, their risk of injury is just through the roof, and that kids, as more and more kids are becoming highly specialized in sport, we're seeing almost like an epidemic of ACL tears, even among like 10, 11-year-olds in soccer and basketball especially. We're seeing also shoulder injuries and elbow injuries, shoulder in volleyball, and elbow injuries in baseball players. He gave one stat, again, this will be my last kind of stat I'll give from him, but it jumped out at me, which is the kind of like what we call the Tommy John surgery, that the elbow surgery for baseball players used to be something that you would see kind of among seasoned like professionals, like 10 years into the major leagues, and you have that surgery. It's a significant thing. Now they're seeing that, I think he said, he gave me the number and I wrote it down somewhere, but this huge percentage, a quarter of them now are in 18-year-olds or younger of those surgeries, which was non-existent before. So we're seeing, kids in their mid-teens getting their elbows operated on. So they're really like serious stuff in a lot of ways. So if you haven't seen that video, I encourage you to read his work or to watch that brief video. His work was highlighted in ESPN recently on this crisis. But I wanted today to talk a little bit more, not just about the kind of physiological aspect of youth sport injuries and specialization, but also a little bit about the psychological aspects of it. There's a lot written about this as well, but we were talking a little bit earlier that even when we know something in our minds, we know it cognitively, we still do it. We know something is wrong, especially when we're in our adolescence. But even as adults, we know. Like we use the example of smoking or drinking or these things, like there's all kinds of data that show that's not good for you, but people still do it. Well, why do we make decisions even though we are informed in a lot of ways? There's lots to say about that, but one thing I wanted to talk about today a little bit was this idea of cognitive bias and how that comes into play for us. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit today. But before I do that, I'm going to start with our great coaches here from wrestling. It's a world that I don't know about. So Coach Reeder, I'd be interested in hearing, like, how does a young kid get into wrestling? What are the kind of initiation phases of wrestling look like? And what's kind of just the early progression, say from someone initially getting into the sport to like getting serious about it? I know there are lots of ways kids do it, but are there certain trends in it? And if you had to say what it looks like these days, could you give some general sense for where competition occurs?
You can jump in here too, but I think that the kind of the progression for nowadays for a wrestler is you're seeing these kids getting into it way early and starting to specialize, like you're talking. Me personally, I started when I was 5 years old, and I've never done anything else. I was a one-sport athlete for my whole career. And it worked for me, and it doesn't work for a lot of other people, but I think it's different. There's guys that are getting exposed when they're freshmen in high school. It kind of just whenever.
But as a young kid, so what does a 5 through 10-year-old say? Just I love wrestling. It's all I want to do is wrestling. What are you actually doing? Like I don't even. You're in meets on weekends. Right. Is it
you're
throughout
practicing
the year?
every day? There's probably a youth practice going on. There's clubs now that. Clubs have become really serious. These specialized clubs have become kind of the new norm for around the country. These specialized clubs around the whole country are starting to develop these guys from a very young age. And I'm talking they're giving them opportunities to practice every single night and to wrestle on every single weekend.
Yeah, probably
I mean, that's 12 months a year. It's not 8 months. These kids are wrestling 12 months a year.
they're competing 2 to 3 times a week
Mhm.
on a Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and then probably more now. They're traveling multiple states.
Mhm.
Where back when we were growing up, it was you might
More
travel local.
And now there's millions and millions of different pop-up tournaments that are starting, these national tournaments that everybody and their brother thinks that my kid needs to be in that tournament or he's
Yeah.
not going to be
Yeah.
good. And so
if you want to dive in headfirst as a second grader, you can go full
a
speed.
full tilt.
Yeah.
Full tilt.
And learning technique, but then also competing.
Absolutely.
Yeah, okay. Tanner has some experience with the youth football world, which I don't either have much experience with that. Can you answer the same question about youth football? What does it look like? What are the options? Or, I mean, lots of options. Again, I know there's variants, but what are some of the trajectories you see these days in youth football? Has it changed?
I would say it's gotten younger, but the level that you can compete 12 months out of the year in football just isn't reality. A lot of times it's still in the fall, right? For a lot of these young athletes, there's some leagues where you can start in 3rd and 4th grade, full pads. A lot of flag football starts at that age. And then I know you get into Pop Warner, and some communities have like 5th and 6th grade football, but those are for a couple weekends throughout the fall. And a lot of times if you're going to specialize within just football, most of those guys are, you have your season and then maybe you hire a trainer outside of the season to work. If you're a quarterback, you got a quarterback coach or an offensive lineman, and then you're hitting the weight room a lot of times working on those things. So it's less as you're talking about specialized.
Yeah.
It's one of the sports that's kind of unique in that way because you can't play 12 months out of the year. It's just not how it works. But it's definitely starting younger.
Yeah. Football actually is a really interesting sport when you talk about injury, because it's so much in the public right now with head injuries. And yet it is one of the sports that has the least kind of, kind of percent of highly specialized. It's the most kind of truncated season of most of the seasons we know. It's very difficult to play soccer, or to play basketball, which I'm familiar with, in a very limited way. But football is one of the sports. It sounds like wrestling is becoming more and more difficult to do that as well. So football is interesting in that way. I think we could talk about soccer or other sports that have similar kind of changes where it's getting younger, it's getting more intense, a lot of sports. So I wanted to talk about, from a psychological perspective, what might be some explanations for this, and then come around full circle to how might we as coaches or as leaders or people who work on campuses or with kids, how might we make things better? How might we be aware of this? So there's a kind of a whole literature on cognitive bias we talk about, and there are all different types of cognitive bias, meaning what we know and how what we know is shaped by kind of our own perspective, our own biases. So one of these is called an anchoring bias, which is kind of like the first thing we hear about something, it becomes our reference point. So again, I've shared this example, we talked about it. If you are going to buy a house and if you go and you see the price and it's listed for a $300,000 house, and then you get to buy the house for $280,000, what do you think? Like, I got a great deal. I got like $20,000 below asking price. But you could flip that and you could say, well, if you saw the house as $250,000 and you bought it for $280,000, you might think, well, geez, I overpaid. Same house, but your initial reference point set some sort of expectation. Now we know kind of in the literature, that's just a very simplistic example, but there are a lot of things that you could think about growing up that, like, whether it's something about like your beliefs about like religion or beliefs about other people or beliefs about a sport or about anything, it's set in a certain way, and not that we stay the same, but it's our starting point, it's our reference point that is impactful. So this anchoring bias, I see it as a challenge with this youth sports stuff we're talking about, and here's how I have seen it in the basketball world. It's that we often have these kind of eager parents who want to do what's right for their kids. Like, every parent wants to do what's right for their kids. They want what's best for their kids. But who's really good at messaging about youth basketball? It's the people who are selling it. We see these. We've talked about the socioeconomics of youth sport. How we have these big sports complexes popping up all over. We have club teams all over, and they're selling the sport. So one of the things they do really well is they get parents really young, they get kids really young, and they promote it. And they say, if you want to get to here, if you want to play on your high school varsity, or if you want to get to college, or if you want to get to the pros, start now with us and do this. And they're very effective at that. And there's a reason that youth sports is over a $15 billion enterprise right now. So that's the first thing parents hear, and that is hard to break free from. Not that we all kind of hold tight to that, but it's an anchoring bias, I think, that it has an impact on what we're talking about. The first thing we hear is you got to start early, and you got to go hard, you got to practice hard. The second bias is this, we call the bandwagon effect, and I think we all know this, we've all lived this, which is the kind of the fear of missing out thing. Everyone in your neighborhood's doing it, everyone in your school is doing it, you've got to do it. If you don't do it, what's going to happen? You're going to fall behind. It's like an academic thing we see a lot in schools. Did you be what kind of teacher?
English.
English. Well, you don't see as much in English, but you see a lot in math, where you have a lot of parents who are eager, eager parents wanting their kids to get to the best college. Well, early on, look at math, and they'll look at, if you're not in the right math class in 7th grade, then you're going to fall behind in 8th grade, and then you're not going to get into the right ones in high school. Then you're not going to get into the good college. And they start projecting as like a scaffold. It builds upon each other. The bandwagon effect, we can see a lot of that in sport, which is that if all of you are doing this with your kid, and my kid's not doing it, well, she's going to miss out on that team. She's not going to get the scholarship. That's a powerful thing. So if you match that with anchoring bias and you have the bandwagon effect, there's like this social force to it, and it can be problematic. The last one I will say is what we call survivorship bias, meaning we can take I'll give an example that has been shared a lot, is like if you go to like an old city, an old place in Europe or something, and you see a really old building that's looks beautiful, and you're getting a tour, and they talk about the craftsmanship that occurred 2,000 years ago or 1,000 years ago, and this building is still standing, and how good were those craftsmen to have built it? Well, yes, they were, but we don't see all the fallen down ones that over the hundreds of years have gone down. We see the survivor. We have the same thing often in youth sports, where you could point to, like right now in the NBA, I follow the NBA pretty closely, and every year, like the NBA draft, they'll do a profile on a kid, and they'll start showing clips from when the kid was 10 years old, 12 years old, 14 years old. And I'm a parent sitting at home, I'm watching this kid playing in Las Vegas when he's 10, and all this stuff, and I'm seeing him and thinking, well, that's the way to go. This is what this NBA guy did. I'm not seeing the hundreds of kids that he played with along the way who tore an ACL, or got burned out, or ran out of money, or all kinds of things that happen. I'm seeing the survivor. We're all affected by that. We see the survivors in a lot of things that we do. I think that any of these they're partially explaining, not fully, but they're partially explaining why, even though we have all this data on how highly specialized sports at a young age are a negative thing, can be a negative thing, we keep doing it, and it's become a social kind of challenge. The last thing I'll say about Professor Bell, before we move on to I ask you a question, is that this is not just a parent issue about I don't want my kids to be hurt. Of course I don't want my kids to be hurt. It's a bigger issue. It's an issue for universities. So when kids come to us, to a university like the University of Wisconsin, and we sign them for a scholarship, this is a very kind of a cold-blooded way of thinking about this, but if you sign a kid to a women's basketball player to a scholarship, we're giving her 4-year scholarship to play basketball here. What we often don't look at as much is if you're just in a very cold-blooded transactional way of looking at this as an investment in a kid, not looking at your feelings or any of that stuff, which we do. you're making a 4-year investment. It's a costly thing for that kid. Well, we know more and more that, what Professor Bell shared is that early injury exacerbates future risk. So if you had a serious stress injury, if you had an ACL, or if you had a shoulder, or in wrestling in their
Hips.
if you had these things when you were 10, 12, 14, 16, they are a predictor of later. They heighten your risk in the future. So as kids are showing up to our campuses stronger than ever, faster than ever, more skilled than ever, they're also showing up like underneath the skin more, in many cases, more damaged than ever, like more susceptible to injury than ever. So it's something that is not only affecting, if you look at the professionals, the NBA injury rates are higher than they've ever been. You can see, just look at the NBA finals last year. We have two of the very best players. One tears his ACL, Klay Thompson, Kevin Durant pops his Achilles. Both these are guys who are products of long time of playing hoops. That's really common now in the NBA, and it's also happening at the college level. Kids are showing up more at risk of injury. Then along with that, there's it's almost Dr. Bell has talked about as a public health crisis, in that we have millions and millions of kids now who are kind of in this. They're in it, and they're doing this from a young age, and they are all, whether they make it or not, they're getting injured. And that's expensive, and it's bad for kind of lifelong kind of wellness. So we talk about lifelong wellness, having an active life. Early sports are a gateway to an active life. I would like my kids to do sports so that they can learn about the value of sport. They can be healthy, they can be fit, they can have a good long life ahead of them. Well, if they're getting injured at that age, and then when they're 40 years old, unable to hit a tennis ball, or unable to take a run, that's a problem for a lifelong challenge. So this is not just a short-term thing, but it's a significant issue for us all to think about. And I think we need to think about not just physiologically, but also kind of the psychology of it. So that leads me to my question. Considering the psychology of it, how do we, maybe I'll first come to you guys as coaches here right now. What can we, what are your initial thoughts about it? Is there anything we can do about this, or what, psychologically, what can we do?
I think that, it is a tricky situation, and just like you said, you got kids that you're a living example of it. I truly believe at the young age you should be teaching fundamentals and the love for the sport. And I've seen so many times where parents ruin the future for this kid because they're so fired up about Johnny winning a national title when he's 6 years old, which means nothing. We're not recruiting 6-year-olds, right? But they're stuck in that situation where, well, Johnny's doing this, he should be doing it because all of his friends are doing it, right? And if he doesn't want to progress, then he's going to get left behind. So I think that they should be taught the fundamentals and the passion to be involved and just learning to love the sport.
So if you're talking to a parent of a young kid, you're forgetting
It's
like
hard,
the love
right?
of,
I got kids now too,
right.
and,
The love
and
of
my
the
daughter
game.
is getting to the part where
Yeah.
she could be in youth sports soon. Do I want to get her heavily involved in all these traveling soccer teams, or do I want to, hold her back and try to make her love the sport? And it is tricky.
Yeah.
It is a tricky situation. So I think it's individual based, but you got to make sure that these kids at those youth age are emotionally unstable. Right?
Yeah.
They're 6-year-old kids.
Yeah.
So making them, that you love them, and whatever happens, you're there for them.
This issue about messaging that's done so well by the commercialized aspect of youth sport is done so well. Like, they get the message out, they get the message to the community, which we talked about, that you need to start. Sometimes I think what I'm hearing from you is, like, along with that message of training opportunities, and that it needs to be this message of fun, enjoyment, love of the game, not a message of you got to do this to get to college, right?
All right.
What from a physical training perspective, is there, again, from the kind of physiological world, what was your reaction to the psychological domain? Did you see that as the training domain?
So one thing that comes to mind is the social aspect of it, because as you're getting older, 6 or 7, you're learning how to interact with other kids. You're learning how to play well and not, hurt people, and just kind of learning those basic skills. And when I think about like tennis or swimming, those individualized sports, if you are putting that pressure on a kid that's in like a lone sport versus like a team sport, you're also losing that social component of it. And so I think that hinders some kids from learning the socialization and being in social settings and missing out on that team aspect of it, which I think is also vital. But I think also like on the playing multiple sports when you're kind of growing up, I think you gain certain skills and motor skills and hand-eye coordination and other things that may help you in order to be specialized when you get a little bit older. I think you gain different skills and you train different muscles groups when you kind of have a variety of different things that you're learning to do. So if you're a baseball player and a tennis player, you're still doing the overhead stuff. Like you're training your muscles in different ways. So I think like if you are able to kind of do different cross training and just kind of expose yourself to everything, you're only going to benefit yourself and your body and your muscles, and kind of train yourself to learn different skills that if you focus on one thing, you're not going to be able to learn.
This the discussion of being a multi-sport athlete, many of some of the leading coaches out there right now at the college level are talking about how they prefer to, as much as we hear the specialization is important, a lot of them prefer athletes who have sampled, who have tried different things, because of what you just said. They're more well balanced. They've learned. A lot of these sports are complementary. The other aspect of that, however, is the argument that high specialization leads to more skill. So again, I'm thinking of a wrestler who starts when he's 5. I'm thinking he's learning something between ages 5 and 15 that the 15-year-old did not learn. So I'm thinking there's a skill advantage to starting early, but it seems like that must be connected with some degree of balance and recovery, and also love of the game as well. You can't. I mean, the skill benefit is going to fall to the wayside if the kid's burnt out, doesn't want to do it.
That's just what you're
not recovering.
What are you emphasizing as from 5 to 15? Are you emphasizing fundamentals and enjoying the sport, or are you making your kid wrestle every single weekend and burning him out, and by 15 he's done? Yeah.
This data that 70% of kids drop out of sport by age 13. I mean, so one way you could say, like, okay, we're going to just drill from the time they're 5, and we're going to have this highly specialized group of this, like, army of talented robots, But on the other hand, you're losing 70% of your population on the wayside, versus if you have a bigger pool from which to draw if you're doing it in a healthy way. So, how about this idea of kind of survivorship? The soccer world. There's a lot of pressure in the soccer world that I've experienced as a parent. If your child is not doing this, she or he is not going to make the top team, or they're not going to make it. Do you have any thoughts about how could we better? Is it the same message as it is in wrestling, or is there anything different?
It makes me think about too, even with like youth sports. I mean, everybody. I always hear, kind of speaking to the first point of like the narrative, it becomes the norm. What you hear about right away, get your kids involved. And parents too, they want their kids to be a part of the team, learn the social aspect and things like that. But it makes me wonder too, like, do the risks outweigh the benefits, or vice versa? And like, what parts of sports are actually beneficial, right? They teach resilience, grit, learning various skill sets. But can I work better on a team now because I had to work through things when I was on a team younger, and I had to constantly do that? And I know definitely growing up, I mean, I'm looking at these big time players on the big time stage being like, I want to be them, but there's so many other people that they have to play with and that have also set them up for success too. But I'm really thinking about like what actually, especially for kids, being on a team, what parts are the beneficial part? Is it learning that skill set so you can specialize later, or is it more the social aspect and learning, like thinking about like being well and working through some of those tough times or tough losses, or if your team isn't winning or you are winning and things like that?
I think our message has gotten so overwhelmed by the making it message, meaning like get to the varsity or get to college. And we sometimes, the good in sport is what you just talked about. It's the social component, it's the learning to overcome something, that get up off the ground when something goes wrong, that we use for our whole lives. Like we all face adversity as a parent or as someone in a job, or we face problems, we have to get up, we learn those things. Any other thoughts, Tanner? That we haven't.
I guess somewhat along the lines of her is like, at the end of the day, you're talking about sport and growing the good, right?
Yeah.
I think we're somewhat getting confused of how many people actually play professional sports.
Yeah.
How many go to college to play, right?
Yeah.
And now 70% are out by 13.
Yeah.
Well, then all the good that happens through sport, they're not even receiving that, the benefits of that. And I think it becomes somewhat of like, we've disordered what sport is within our society, right? And within families, and you buy into that, and now these are the side effects of doing so.
This is the other part. I think the early message has to be about the good in sport, and there also has to be some, honestly, almost some financial literacy lessons here, which is Travis Dorsch does this work at Utah State, and talks about not only how much money people spend on their kids. Some people spend $10,000 a year on their kids' sport when they're not able to pay for a lot of other things in their lives. But also that, the soccer example, soccer is a very expensive sport for kids when they're young. If you're looking at it from a financial perspective, not only are most kids not going to be good enough to play, but even those who are good enough are going to teams that are sharing, like, how many scholarships on an entire team. Like, I think a lot of people have this impression that if you make it to D1, you've got a full ride. And most of our sports share a number of scholarships. So even that aspect of, not only do a minute kind of portion of the young kids make it, but even those who do play at the collegiate level, most of them, they're still paying a good chunk of their tuition. As we think about, again, just to conclude, the physiological and the psychological go together. They're not, and it's not good enough for us just to know the kind of physiology of it, that we have to, as leaders, as coaches, we have to work with the psychology of it. And when we see a parent, we have to know that just giving them a paper full of data, there's all this other stuff going on. There's the bandwagon effect, there's this anchoring bias, there's the survivorship bias, all these things at play. And so we have these roles that we can be better kind of informers of what's going on. Not to discourage people from participating. All of us are here, I think, because we're pretty serious about sport, and it's been good to us. It's been good to us in lots of ways. But to be well informed ourselves so we can be well informative to others. So thank you. This is, I think it's an important topic, and I appreciate the conversation. Thank you guys for joining.